The price for her was 2 lame horses and a Winchester rifle that was missing its firing pin. Her father, a man whose hands were perpetually stained with the dirt of a farm that gave back only dust, did not look at her as he sealed the bargain. He looked at the Apache warrior, Cale, a man carved from the red rock and silence of the desert itself. Alara stood beside the sagging porch, her worn calico dress, a flimsy shield against the judgment of the sun. Barren. The word had been whispered in the church, spat in the privacy of her own home, and now it was the reason for her exile. A woman who could not give her husband a son was a fallow field, a broken tool. So she was being traded for broken things. She risked a glance at the warrior. His face was a mask of impassive lines, his black hair stirring in the hot breeze. He did not look at her either. He looked through her, as if she were already a ghost. Her husband, Thomas, was dead 6 months, a mercy she hadn't dared pray for, but accepted with a guilt that soured her throat. His final, wheezing accusation had been her infertility. Now, her father was finishing the job. "She's yours," he grunted, shoving the rifle into Cale's hand. The Apache's fingers closed around the wood, and for the first time, his eyes met Alara's. There was no cruelty in them, no triumph. There was nothing. An emptiness that mirrored the hollowed-out space behind her own ribs. He gave a short, sharp nod, turned, and began walking away, expecting her to follow, and she did. Each step away from the only life she'd ever known was a nail in the coffin of the woman she used to be. She did not look back. There was nothing there to see. The journey was a crucible of silence. For 3 days, they moved through a landscape of skeletal mesas and shimmering heat. The sun was a hammer, and the silence was an anvil. Alara had expected brutality, a hand that would shove or strike. Instead, there was only a profound and unnerving absence of contact. Cale moved ahead of her, a fluid shadow against the unforgiving terrain. He never spoke, but he would leave a waterskin for her where the trail grew steep, or pause under the scant shade of a juniper, just long enough for her to catch her breath. These were not acts of kindness, she told herself. They were acts of maintenance. He was preserving his property, the same way her father would mend a fence post or oil a hinge. She was a thing, a piece of a transaction. At night, he would build a small, smokeless fire and hand her a piece of dried meat before turning his back to her, a sentinel watching the stars wheel overhead. She would huddle on the other side of the flames, the heat a poor substitute for human warmth, and listen to the yip of coyotes. They sounded like grieving women. On the 3rd evening, as a bruised twilight settled over the canyons, a rattlesnake coiled in her path, its warning a dry, lethal whisper. Alara froze, her heart seizing in her chest. Before she could scream, Cale was there. He hadn't made a sound, but he moved with the swift, deadly grace of a striking hawk. A flash of his knife, a blur of motion, and the snake lay headless in the dust. He kicked the twitching body aside and looked at her. His gaze wasn't on her face, but on her trembling hands. He said nothing. He didn't need to. In his eyes, she saw not a savior, but a man accustomed to dispatching threats with quiet efficiency. She was just another thing he was responsible for keeping alive, at least until they reached their destination. The thought offered no comfort at all. His village was not a village, not in the way she understood it. It was a scattering of wickiups, domed shelters of brush and hide that seemed to grow from the earth itself. They blended so perfectly with the landscape that she almost didn't see them until they were among them. Faces turned as they entered. Hard faces. Women paused in their work, their dark eyes lingering on her pale skin and foreign dress, with a suspicion that was as sharp as broken glass. Children fell silent and stared. This was a different kind of judgment from the one she'd known. Back home, they pitied her for what she lacked. Here, they despised her for what she was. Kyle led her to a wickiup that stood slightly apart from the others. It was small, empty. The air inside smelled of dust and dry willow. He gestured for her to enter, then left a water skin and a blanket by the entrance, and then he was gone. She was alone again, but this time, the solitude was surrounded by 100 watching eyes. The night was worse than it had been on the trail. The sounds were closer. The soft murmur of a language she didn't understand, the cry of a baby, the low rhythm of a distant drum. It was the sound of a life she would never be a part of. She curled up under the thin blanket, her body aching, her spirit scraped raw. She thought of her mother, who had cried when Thomas died but had not shed a single tear when her own daughter was traded away. A good daughter plows the family field, her father had always said. She provides a crop of sons. Alara pressed her hands against her flat stomach, a gesture of old, familiar grief. A barren field. The insult had followed her here, into this dark, lonely hut. The wind soughed through the brush walls, whispering the same word, over and over, empty, empty, empty. Days bled into a routine of quiet observation. Ilara learned to stay out of the way, a ghost haunting the edges of the camp. The other women ignored her, their backs a wall of silent condemnation. She tried to make herself useful, fetching wood or water, but her movements were clumsy, inefficient. She fumbled with the grinding stone, spilling precious cornmeal into the dirt, earning a sharp, derisive sound from an older woman with eyes like chips of obsidian. Alara's face burned with a shame so hot it felt like a fever. She was useless here, too, a burden in a new language. That afternoon, Cale returned from a hunt with 2 rabbits. He skinned them with an economy of motion that was mesmerizing, then handed one to her. She stared at the raw meat, unsure of what to do. Back home, the butchering was men's work. He watched her hesitation, his face unreadable. Then, with a sigh so quiet it was barely audible, he took the rabbit back. He built a small fire, spitted the meat, and cooked it. He didn't look at her as he worked, but she felt his gaze on her, heavy with something she couldn't name. It wasn't anger. It was weariness. A few days later, she saw him mending a child's moccasin, his large, calloused hands, surprisingly gentle, with the needle and sinew. An orphan boy named Nalin, whose eyes held the same haunted look she saw in the mirror, watched him with a quiet reverence. Cale finished and handed the moccasin to the boy, ruffling his hair. It was the first truly gentle gesture she had seen from him. Later, while trying to draw water from the creek, her foot slipped on a mossy rock. She fell hard, her arm scraping against the stone, opening a long, bloody gash. She bit back a cry, tears of pain and frustration stinging her eyes. Suddenly, Cale was there, kneeling beside her. He examined the wound without a word, his touch surprisingly careful. He tore a strip from his own shirt and bound her arm tightly. As he tied the knot, his fingers brushed against her skin. It was not a lover's touch, not even a husband's. It was the touch of a healer. He stood, looked down at her for a long moment, and then uttered a single word. "Stay." It was a command, but it was the first word he had ever spoken directly to her. And for some reason, it felt less like an order and more like a promise. She began to learn the language of his world, a tongue spoken not with words, but with actions. She watched how the women tanned hides until their hands were stained and strong, how they found roots and berries in a land that had looked utterly desolate to her. She learned that a downturned branch meant a trail was unsafe, and that the call of a certain bird heralded the rain. Cale remained a man of few words, but he became her silent teacher. He would leave a particular type of leaf by her dwelling's entrance. Later, she would see an old woman crushing the same leaf to make a poultice for a cough. He once pointed to the sky, and hours later, a dust storm swept through the canyon, forcing everyone inside. He was teaching her to see, to listen, to survive. One evening, as a sliver of moon hung in the indigo sky, she saw him sitting alone, staring into the embers of their small fire. The orphan, Nalin, approached him timidly and offered him a small, smooth stone. Kale took it, his stoic mask cracking for just a second. A deep, profound sadness washed over his features, so raw and unguarded that Alara had to look away. When she dared to look back, the mask was in place again, but she had seen the man beneath it. She started tending to the small plot of earth outside her wickiup. At first, she just cleared the rocks, the repetitive motion a balm for her restless mind. Then she found a few hardy desert flowers and transplanted them. The other women watched, some with amusement, some with scorn. A garden for a barren woman. The irony was not lost on her. But Kale noticed. He left a small clay pot of water by her fledgling garden one morning. It was a silent acknowledgement, an offering. That night, she tended to the bandage on his hand, which he'd cut while carving an arrow. As she carefully cleaned the wound, he didn't pull away. "You have a healer's touch," he said, his voice a low rasp. She looked up, startled. "My mother was a healer," she replied softly, the words feeling strange in her mouth. He nodded, his gaze distant. "My wife was, too." He paused, the silence stretching between them, thick with ghosts. "The sickness took her, and my son." He said it flatly. A simple statement of fact, but it held the weight of a shattered world. In that moment, he was no longer a silent warrior or a savage captor. He was a man hollowed by the same grief that lived in her bones. He did not see a barren woman. He saw a fellow survivor. The past arrived on a dust-choked horse. Her brother, Josiah, rode into the camp as if he owned it, his face a thundercloud of self-righteous fury. He reined his horse to a halt, scattering children, and glared at the wickiups with open contempt. "Ilara!" he bellowed, the name a violation in the quiet air. She emerged from her dwelling, her heart a cold stone in her stomach. He looked her up and down, his lip curling at her simple buckskin dress, her braided hair. "Look at you," he sneered. "Living like an animal. Father sent me. You're to come home. Home." The word was a bitter joke. "This is my home," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. Josiah laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "This, a sty full of savages? Don't be a fool. The deal's off. The magistrate says a trade like that ain't legal without a proper Christian marriage. That land is ours. You're coming back." He wasn't there to save her. He was there for the land. She had been a commodity then, and she was a commodity now. Kyle emerged from the shadows, silent as ever, a bow in his hand. He didn't notch an arrow, but its presence was a clear threat. He stood slightly in front of her, a living shield. He didn't understand Josiah's words, but he understood the venom in his tone, the predatory glint in his eyes. "Get out of the way, redskin," Josiah spat, reaching for the pistol at his hip. "This is family business." Ilara stepped forward, placing a hand on Kale's arm. "No," she said, her voice ringing with a strength she didn't know she possessed. She looked directly at her brother, at the man who had watched her father trade her away without a word of protest. "I am not your business anymore. Go!" Josiah's face contorted with rage. "He'll tire of you, little sister. A barren field yields nothing. When he casts you aside, don't come crawling back to us." He wheeled his horse around and galloped away, leaving a cloud of dust and hatred in his wake. The entire camp had watched the exchange. When Alara turned, The obsidian-eyed woman who had scorned her met her gaze. The woman gave a slow, deliberate nod. It wasn't friendship. It was respect. The confrontation had changed everything. She was no longer just the white woman, the outsider. She was the woman Kale had defended, the woman who had stood against her own people for the sake of his. The invisible wall between her and the other women began to crumble. It started with small things. A woman showed her the right way to grind corn, her hands guiding Ilara's. Another offered her a piece of fry bread, warm and fragrant. The orphan, Naylan, who had always watched her from a distance, began to follow her like a small shadow, eventually daring to take her hand as she tended her tiny, impossible garden. He would bring her things, a pretty stone, a fallen feather, a shy, gap-toothed smile. She found herself smiling back, a genuine smile that reached her eyes for the first time in years. She was beginning to understand that family was not about blood. It was about who stood with you when the world tried to tear you down. Kale watched this transformation with his usual quiet intensity. One evening, he sat with her by the fire, Naylan asleep nearby with his head in Ilara's lap. Kale was carving a small wooden figure, a hawk with outstretched wings. "He likes you," Kale said, not looking up from his work. "The people see your spirit. It is not weak." "I thought I was weak for a long time," Ilara admitted, stroking Naylan's hair. "I was told I was. Your people value the wrong things," he said simply. He held up the finished hawk. "A hawk is not strong because it lays many eggs. It is strong because it can fly through the storm." He placed the carving in her hand. The wood was smooth and warm. It was a gift, a story, a new name for who she was. She had been a bargaining chip her whole life, passed from one hand to another, but a hawk belongs to no one but the sky. What do you do when you finally decide to stop being played? You learn to fly. Josiah returned, and this time he did not come alone. He brought a dozen men with him, a posse of grim-faced farmers and ranchers, armed with rifles and a righteous fury. They were not an official law party. They were a lynch mob with a flimsy excuse. "They've stolen a white woman," Josiah had claimed in the nearest settlement. "We're going to get her back." But it was never about her. It was about the land, the water, the simmering hatred of a people they deemed lesser. The attack came at dawn. The first gunshot shattered the morning peace, a profane sound in the sacred quiet. Chaos erupted. The Apache warriors, Kale among them, melted into the rocks and trees, their bows singing a deadly response. It was not a battle, it was a slaughter in the making. The ranchers had numbers and rifles, but the Apache had the land itself as an ally. Ilara's first instinct was to hide. The terror was a cold hand squeezing her heart. But then she saw Naylan, his face pale with fear, and the old woman who had given her the bread get struck in the leg by a stray bullet. Something inside her shifted. The fear did not vanish, but it was overshadowed by a fierce, protective rage. She was not a warrior. She could not fire a bow or wield a knife. But she was a healer. She grabbed the satchel of herbs Kale had taught her to identify, pulled Naylan to the relative safety behind a large boulder, and scrambled to the old woman's side. Using the lessons Kyle had given her, she packed the wound with yarrow to stop the bleeding and bound it tightly. Her hands, once clumsy and useless, moved with purpose and speed. Throughout the fight, she became a whirlwind of desperate care, moving from one fallen person to another, applying poultices, binding wounds, offering a sip of water or a word of comfort. She was no longer the barren woman. She was life in the face of death, a gardener tending to her people in a field of violence. The fighting was desperate, a chaotic dance of shadows and gunfire. From her makeshift infirmary behind the rocks, Ilara could see Kale, He moved with a lethal grace, a phantom of vengeance, his arrows finding their mark with chilling precision. He was protecting his home, his people. He was protecting her. Then she saw Josiah. He was hidden behind a cluster of mesquite, his face contorted in a mask of hate. He wasn't firing randomly into the fray. He was taking careful aim, his rifle steady, the barrel pointed directly at Kael's back. Kael was focused on another attacker and didn't see the danger. Time slowed. Ilara's world narrowed to that single terrible image. The man who had shown her kindness, and the brother who had shown her none. There was no time to shout a warning. Without thinking, she grabbed the heavy stone mortar she had been using to grind herbs and hurled it with all her strength toward Josiah. It wasn't a warrior's throw. It was clumsy and wild, but it was enough. The stone crashed into the brush near his head. The sound and surprise made him flinch, his shot going wide, splintering the rock face harmlessly above Kael's head. Kael spun around, his eyes instantly finding the source of the threat. But Josiah was no longer looking at him. His furious gaze was locked on Ilara. "Traitor!" he hissed, the word carrying across the clearing. He raised his rifle again, this time pointing it directly at her. This was it, the final reckoning. She met his gaze, her fear, a cold fire in her veins. "I am home," she said, her voice clear and unwavering. It was the truest thing she had ever said. The hate in his eyes wavered, replaced by a flash of stunned disbelief. In that split second of hesitation, an arrow flew from the shadows. It struck Josiah in the chest with a sickening thud. He staggered back, a look of profound surprise on his face before collapsing into the dust. Kael stepped out from behind the rocks, his bow still raised, his face grim and final. The threat was over. The dust settled, carrying with it the smell of gunpowder and blood. The surviving ranchers fled, leaving their fallen behind. The cost to the Apache had been high. There were new graves to be dug on the hill overlooking the canyon. The silence that fell over the camp was heavy with grief, but it was also a silence of survival. They had held, they had endured. Ilara worked tirelessly, her small garden of herbs stripped bare to tend to the wounded. The women who had once scorned her now worked beside her, their shared purpose a silent bond of sisterhood. They brought her water and food, their eyes filled with a gratitude that needed no words. That night, a different kind of fire burned in the center of the camp. It was not a fire for cooking or warmth, but a fire of mourning and remembrance. Ilara sat on the edge of the circle, Nalan curled beside her, his small hand clutching hers. She was an outsider still, in some ways, but she was no longer alone. She was part of their grief, part of their resilience. Kael came and sat beside her. He looked into the flames, the firelight carving deep shadows onto his face. He said nothing for a long time. Then he turned to her, his dark eyes searching hers. He reached out and gently touched the fading bruise on her cheek, a faint mark from her fall at the creek. His touch was feather-light, but it sent a tremor through her entire being. It was a touch that spoke of shared battles, of losses understood, of a future forged in fire. "I, ye, na, chi," he said, his voice low and resonant. She didn't understand the words, but she understood the tone. It was a naming. He saw the question in her eyes. "She who fights the wind," he translated. He was no longer seeing the barren woman from a broken world. He was seeing her, the hawk who had learned to fly through the storm. She was not a fallow field. She was the desert after a long-awaited rain, scarred and changed, but vibrantly, stubbornly alive.